Hi guys, Paul here again from the Complete Wobbly Camera Personal Trainer podcast. So, got another programming principle to go over today. Today we're going to be covering what's called the stimulus recovery adaptation curve, or what's more commonly known as the SRA curve. A lot of people have been talking about this. The number one kind of proponent of it is Renaissance Periodization and Mike Israetel, a fantastic company. I'd highly recommend you check them out. And the SRA curve is basically talked about a lot of time as how long it takes you to recover from a stimulus of an exercise to then be able to retrain that muscle group again. So we talk about the squat having an SRA curve. Maybe you could train it Mondays and Thursdays, like 4 days, where deadlifts have a longer SRA curve due to higher level systemic disruption. So that's how most people talk about it. What I want to do today is basically talk about what it means, like what the actual technical meaning of each one is, and then what the 4 different types of curves there are, because we always think of it just in terms of a muscle group. There's 4 types of curves and therefore 4 types of application that we can use this SRA curve to write better programs for our clients. So let's get stuck into it. First thing is stimulus. That's basically the training session. So, stimulus initiates a chemical cascade that starts setting off muscle hypertrophy or endurance adaptations or whatever it is. So the thing with stimulus that everyone thinks about, it's just doing the rep. It's doing the sets and reps of, say, the bench press or whatever lift it is. If the cardiovascular session is, that's a stimulus. If it's a game of sport, that's a stimulus. All these different activities, not just lifting weights, have an SRA curve. So all these things can be looked at in the context of your programming. The recovery is basically as soon as you've had that stimulus and it's finished, it's concluded, your body starts to kick in the process of recovery, with the goal being to return to homeostasis and then hopefully to adapt after that, which is basically, we look at adaptation as being, if this is where your baseline is, adaptation is here. It's a little bit more because you've built new structures to adapt to that stress, so that in the future, if you do that stress that's not as draining on your body, you can do a little bit more. So that's basically the stimulus recovery adaptation curve. So you've got the workout, the sporting event, whatever it is, the recovery phase, which happens as soon as you stop training, and then adaptation. So there's a couple of things that we can be aware of there. We also can look at this quite holistically and look at how our recovery modalities affect this SRA curve. So things like ice bathing, for example, is something that, once you have a stimulus like a hard workout or a hard game, it helps supercharge the recovery. You get faster recovery, but you actually blunt adaptation. So ice baths might be something that's good for athletes in season. For off season, probably not as good an option. So you can start looking at things, other activities in context of the SRA curve and how they have impacts as well. Saunas, for example, may promote recovery to some extent due to a light recovery thing, but they may blunt adaptation from a muscular hypertrophy perspective. Lots of things to start to consider, and it makes things a lot more nuanced, which is also makes them a lot more exciting. So our first curve that we're going to worry about is nervous system technical ability curve. All these concepts taken from the book Science and Principles of Powerlifting Training, or Scientific Approach to Powerlifting Training, I think it is, by Juggernaut Training Systems and Mike Israetel from Renaissance Periodization. Get the book, read it. I'm going to be talking about the principles here based on how I apply them in my practice as a personal trainer and educator. Nervous system technical ability curve is how long it takes. Nervous system technical ability is how we can perform a lift or skill with good technique during a session. So as we keep doing a skill or a lift or whatever it is, we're going to have some kind of performance degradation, whether it's due to overall fatigue, systemic fatigue, enzymatic fatigue, peripheral, central nervous system, aerobic fatigue. All these type of things can kind of affect it. But what happens here is the nervous system for these skills actually returns to baseline pretty quickly. It's quite efficient in that. And this is where a lot of time when we see sports that have a high skill component, so I'm going to serve my biases and talk about basketball, they actually have fairly frequent practice. Like they have, even in a game, they have pre-shoot around and then shoot around at halftime, because they recover their skill quite quickly there. And to maintain a high level of skill, the more exposure they get to it, the higher level of skill that they can develop. So for us in the PT environment, we can find that it's something we don't need to worry about too much. We're not going to see clients in multiple sessions a day, and the reality is most of the exercises that we teach are going to be quite simple in nature. It doesn't take that many exposures to it for people to develop a pretty good degree of technical competency. And if we coach them with technical excellence in mind throughout all training sessions, we'll probably find that they get better and better over time anyway. What we can consider for this, though, is our prehabilitative, rehabilitative clients. They may be better served, rather than doing one bigger rehab session a day, to do 1 to 2 exercises max for one set in multiple exposures per day. If they're doing that, what can happen is they can actually learn those new movements a lot faster. So particularly if they're a neuromuscular recruitment issue. So someone who, hip extension pattern isn't where you want it to be, or they don't have a really good hinge quality. You might find for them, it might be better for them just practicing the hinge unload a couple of times a day for a set of 10 will give you much faster carryover than giving them one big hinge session and one where they're really trying to struggle it, because their skill is going to degrade as they practice it more and more in one chunk of time. Next thing is the muscle hypertrophy curve. And this is really important for us because when we're generally training clients, we're trying to build muscle. Simple. We need to be aware that when we train hard, we lose muscle in that training session, but we get the anabolic response post-training, which muscle gain becomes a net positive. So fractional rate of muscle symphysis is increased for a period of time, a number of days. So we need to be aware that straight away it's elevated for a number of days, but then after that it starts to reset to baseline. So we need to apply the same stimulus again, or a very similar stimulus, while it's still above baseline when it's in that adaptation phase, so then you can get a higher level of adaptation again. And we need to then consider for hypertrophy is that the SRA curve for each lift, each muscle, each whatever it is affected by the degree of homeostatic disruption, so how damn hard it is. So like a heavy and long eccentric workout, like an 8-second eccentric, will have a huge homeostatic disruption in terms of fiber damage, fiber type of the muscle size, training age, all these things are really important. So what do we do with this in the real world? Practically, we need to be focused on technique in each and every workout, because the reason is our clients aren't going to see us that often. Okay, so we need to make sure we're focused on technique so we have a higher nervous system technical execution of it, but we also create as much muscle disruption, homeostatic disruption as we can per training session with the least amount of connective tissue fatigue, which we're going to address in the fourth point here. So when the client's training with us, we want to make sure they get the absolute most out of it, that we kick their butt as much as we can out of each and every lift, and from there, then they can get the most kind of hypertrophy with programming wise, we'll program things with a little bit more frequency. For the nervous system force output curve, this is basically how strong we are, how we can demonstrate it. And it seems to take about a week for people to recover it, but it can be longer when dealing with stronger people. So we don't need to worry about it unless we're training powerlifters. So I'm not going to be talking about that today. I talk about my powerlifting and my strength training module in the mentoring program. But the whole main thing that you want to consider here is don't max out too often. Really maxing out isn't something, because it really distributes a nervous system force output curve. If you max out for fun with your clients all the time, what's going to happen, and yes, I know maxing out is super fun. I do enjoy hitting a good 1RM every now and then. But if we max out all the time, it affects the nervous system force output systemically for up to a period of a week. So it means all the other training sessions don't become as stimulative, but you've got a higher level of fatigue. So it's not really a good bang for your buck situation there. And then finally, we've got the connective tissue integrity curve. So this curve relates how much damage connective tissue takes on in response to hard training. And a lot of the time, connective tissue takes a long time to recover because it's poorly vascularized. It doesn't have very good blood supply. So we need to be aware of this when training an injured client as well. And then also looking at our frequency of movement change. So if a client has an injured area, say a patella tendon, we may need to avoid exercises that create a high degree of disruption there, because they're going to actually increase the connective tissue integrity curve. But this gives us options. So a lot of time, isometric work doesn't have a high degree of disruption when you're doing a particular exercise. Isometrics, they don't have any eccentric phase or any concentric phase, so you don't get anywhere near the muscle damage, and you get a high degree of muscle activation, but you also get a high degree of blood concentration. So isometric work, if someone's got an injured area in a joint, can help you maintain strength in that area, have some form of training effect, and then you've got the advantage of actually bringing blood flow in the area to help accelerate that connective tissue integrity curve and help people get better results. So guys, what I want you to take away from here is that there's a couple of things that we affect when we're training. There are more than this. This list is not exhaustive. It'd be impossible to kind of do that. But when you're looking at things, how can you avoid some of the mistakes that people make in the gym? If we know the muscle hypertrophy curve recovers quite quickly, we could probably see that our body part split workouts where we do a whole day on quads and hams, a whole day of chest. It's interesting that legs only get a whole leg day. Probably aren't best for our muscle hypertrophy curves. We can see that if someone is only doing a lift once every 2 to 3 weeks, their nervous system technical ability curve is probably going to go downhill, which isn't ideal if they're a powerlifter or they've got a skill. And if we're maxing out all the time, we're probably going to cause problems for our clients in the overall recovery and how stimulative every other training session becomes. So really, we just need to become a bit more mature, a bit more sensible what we do, and we're going to do a lot better. So guys, thanks for checking in. Thanks for watching the podcast. Loving all the feedback. Any questions, hit me up. Love to speak to you soon.